Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. Looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 319. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about gorges and temples and the home of tea as we go to the Yunnan Province of southern China.
Sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's interview, I do have three news stories for you. If you like cruising, you might be interested in the story about Barbara Farrand. She has cruised so much that she now gets seasick on land. The story from Travel Mole veteran cruiser Barbara Farrand has found she gets seasick on land after sailing on 47 ships in 17 years. The 71-year-old was struck by the condition called mal de terre after a 3-month world trip in 2009 to celebrate her golden wedding. An Australian entrepreneur has come up with a website for people who met on a plane, hit it off, but forgot to get the number. And the website is called We Met on a Plane. Which reminds me of another plane story. Air New Zealand now is going to let you have a better seat, one of the better seats in the plane. If you're willing to pay for it, they're going to start having passengers bid for the best seats rather than just do it first come, first serve at a fixed price. For links to all three of those stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome back to the show Lee Moore. Lee has been on the show twice talking about China, and he's come back yet a third time to talk about another part of China. Lee, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. It's good to be back. Thanks for having me.
And I had to give Lee a special thanks because the two different episodes that we've done with him on China, one was going to Beijing as an independent traveler, and the other one was going to 3 different weekend trips from Shanghai, including Suzhou, that I went to last year. And Beijing I've also gone to since we have talked last, so I have done a little more traveling in China, but not as much as you have. And you're taking us to yet another spot in China, in a city that I didn't even know.
Yeah, I was hoping we could go to Yunnan, if that's okay.
Sure.
It's in the southwest corner of China, and its capital city is Kunming.
And why should we go to that part of China?
The two other episodes that we did, and most of China, I really feel like, is interesting because it's got so much history. And I know you and I both enjoy history, but Yunnan, the province of Yunnan, is a little different. It is more natural scenery. I feel like with some of the areas in northern China, you can just get too much history. This is probably not going to happen in Yunnan. It's all about the scenery and about different ethnic groups that are there in Yunnan.
You mentioned different ethnic groups, and we talk about that on a couple different of the episodes on China, and I think that some of us who grew up in the West think of Chinese as one ethnic group. That, of course, is vastly mistaken. And every time I go someplace in China, I'm surprised how many more ethnic groups there are than even I thought there were.
Yeah, I know you touched on this a little in your Guangxi episode, but there are 56 main ethnic groups. The Han Chinese, the ones who we think of as Chinese, being the main group, and they make up about 90% of the country. But out in the west and the south, there are a lot of other ethnic groups, and they make up, they're still quite small in number. 10% of all of China is made up of these 55 different ethnic groups. So it's easy to miss them or to not think about them or concentrate on them as much. But there's a lot of interesting stuff to be learned about them.
Okay. And what itinerary would you recommend for Yunnan?
So I know some people are going to disagree with this, but I'm going to focus on three major places: Lijiang, which is in the northwest; Zhongdian, which is even more further northwest. This is right on the edge of Tibet; and Xishuangbanna, which is in the southern corner of Yunnan Province with Laos and Burma on the border there. And I'll have to talk some about Kunming just because it's the capital city and the transportation hub, and if you go to Yunnan, you're going to go through it. So I was hoping just to focus on those three places, those three areas.
Excellent. So it sounds like Kunming is the first place that we need to talk about because that's where we're going to arrive.
Yeah, it's definitely the center. If you go to Yunnan, you're absolutely going to come through here unless you're trying to avoid it. It's called the City of Eternal Spring because it's got really nice weather. Well, I lived there for 2 semesters, about, I guess, 10 months in total. So I know the city fairly well. I like the city, but it's one of those cities that doesn't have that much to offer a tourist, I feel like. Mm-hmm. I just kind of have to put a plug in for it just because you'll necessarily be going through it. The one thing that I think is a really cool, genuinely worthwhile thing to do here is called the Bamboo Temple. Mm-hmm. It's a couple of miles outside the city, so you're going to have to take a bus or a taxi there. If you are having trouble, I would recommend maybe talking to someone at your hotel and trying to have them help you figure out how to get there. But for the most part, it's just a normal Buddhist temple. But inside, there's this work of sculpture. It's probably 50 to 100 different human figures inside this one particular part of the temple, which are strangely realistic because they're sculpture, but they're also entirely fantastical. Like you've got a Buddhist monk riding a giant fish, another monk he's reaching out with his arm, but his arm becomes 10 feet long and reaches up into the ceiling and then it's just hanging down in the ceiling. It's one of those things that's hard to describe. It's really realistic, but it's also really funny. I kind of had a reaction to it that was different from normal reactions to Chinese art. I mean, I like Chinese art. It's nice, but this has a real sense of humor that I think you rarely see in Chinese art. And it's the sculptor's kind of tour de force. I don't know much about the sculptor, but he's done a lot of sculpture work, and this is not only the best thing that he's ever done, but I think it's also one of the few remaining things that he has still around.
Okay.
Other things in Kunming, I would recommend maybe the Yunnan Provincial Museum or the Yunnan Military Academy. The Military Academy, it's just this it's a very pretty colonial building, mm-hmm. and it was used as a military academy about probably 100 years ago, and there's a really nice, thorough museum with I believe some stuff in English. I'm not sure how much, but still it's a fairly interesting place to look around. So if you're coming through Kunming, I would definitely recommend those 2 museums. It's not something to go out of your way for, either of those museums, but if you're in town, definitely go to them. And one thing that I don't know how to classify it, it's called the Hump. It's a hostel, actually, and it's a nice place to stay, but it's also kind of a museum. They've got pictures all up on the walls of the Hump, which those of y'all who are familiar with World War II will know that was the flight from Burma to Kunming that the Allies helped supply China with. And so it started in Burma and it ended in Kunming, actually. And so it's a hostel, but it's also almost like a museum. So if you're interested in that aspect of Kunming's history, I definitely recommend it. The Flying Tigers, an American volunteer fighter force, was also based mostly in Kunming, and it talks about them some in this pretty cool hostel.
Yeah, I noticed that since you and I decided to do this episode, I hadn't realized there was the Flying Tiger connection. So some people may even have seen Kunming featured in American movies without realizing where they were looking at in China.
Absolutely. One interesting thing about Kunming, and this is just kind of historical fact, I don't know how relevant it is, the airport is actually only 4 or 5 miles outside of the city, which is strange because if you've been to China, you know most airports are 30, 40, 50 miles outside of the city. And the reason for that is because I believe that airport was used by the Flying Tigers. So it's actually quite an old airport.
Interesting. Excellent. And then it sounds like from there we pack our bags and head out of Kunming.
I would go from there to Lijiang. Lijiang is this 800, 900-year-old really interesting town. Well, first off, I should say it was destroyed in a 1996 earthquake, so it's all been rebuilt, but it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and they've done a really good job of doing preservation with the architecture, so it doesn't feel like a normal Chinese town when you're in the old town. It feels very different, very historical. One thing I don't like about Lijiang is there are so many tourists going there, and I mean that's inevitable when I'm recommending on a tourist show to go somewhere that's nice for tourists. Of course they're going to be, but I feel like it kind of, especially at night, gets overrun. So one thing I would recommend to your listeners is that they go in the morning, like 7 or 8 o'clock, right after you wake up. The town is pretty dead, and it's quite beautiful, and it's easy to appreciate that beauty at 7 in the morning, whereas if you go at 7 at night, it's going to be kind of overrun with lots of tour groups, and I find it less appealing. I'll say that much.
Now, is that a place that we can day trip to, or are you recommending we spend the night and then get up early?
You're definitely going to have to spend the night. It's about, I think, 7 or 8 hours from Kunming. Okay. You can take a night bus. They have in China, I guess I might have mentioned this in some of the previous shows, but they have night buses which you can sleep on. So you leave from Kunming at 10 or 11 at night, and then you arrive there early in the morning and find a hotel. So it kind of saves you. You can add your hotel and your bus fare into the same fare, and it's quite comfortable, I think. So I definitely recommend, if you're going from Kunming to Lijiang, it's an 8-hour bus ride, unless you're flying, which you can fly. I would recommend taking the night bus to get there.
Okay.
I guess as far as other things to do there, there's the Black Dragon Pool. It's a really pretty park, but it also has several museums off to the side. There's a Dongba Cultural Museum, which, to start to get into the ethnic groups in the area, the Naxi are the main ethnic group around Lijiang, and the Dongba are a group of wizards who are part of Naxi culture. They have supposedly the only hieroglyphic writing system still in use. I don't know exactly how much it is in use, but that's what they say. It's really interesting. They have a lot of interesting stuff in the museum there. I actually got to meet one of the wizards. He was really nice, talked to me for a little while. So that's kind of interesting.
Now, I know the current Chinese alphabet started as more of a hieroglyphic alphabet. So are they just using an older Chinese alphabet, or is it just have a different origin entirely?
It has a different origin entirely.
Okay.
I think it might have been sort of informed by, I think it might have drawn some later on Chinese characters, but I don't think it shares any origin with the Chinese writing system because it's so far away from the part of China where the Chinese writing system developed, if that makes sense. For the next thing I would recommend to do in Lijiang, it's kind of outside of Lijiang. It's only, I think, a 2 or 3 hour bus ride away. It's called Tiger Leaping Gorge. I'm not sure. Have you heard of it in your travels at all?
I have not, but then I haven't been to southern China at all and have been barely to China compared to you. But
it's kind of a mandatory stop on the backpacker trail. It's one of the world's steepest gorges. On one side, you've got the Snowy Jade Dragon Mountain, and on the other side, the side that you're hiking on, you're actually kind of on the edge of the Yangtze River. It's where the Yangtze River makes its first turn, and it's magnificently beautiful. We went there in October. Snow was on the mountain on the other side, and it's actually a quite easy hike. I know you have a pretty wide range of different kinds of travelers in your audience. I would say if you can walk for an hour, you could do this hike. It's not a very rigorous hike.
It's not trekking in Nepal.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's definitely not trekking in Nepal, yeah. But it is similar to Nepal in this. When I did trekking in Nepal, they had tea houses. And this hike also has kind of little restaurant tea houses about every 30 minutes along the way. And so you can stop and take a break pretty much any time you want to. But you're hiking through fields. You've got the mountains on the other side and the gorge down below. And it's really quite pretty. And there are a couple of spots where it's pretty steep. I think there's a cutback that's like 39 different turns. That's significantly steep. But when I use the term hike, I don't want people to think, like you said, Nepal. This isn't Everest. This is very easy. Anybody can do it kind of thing.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the weather. What time of year would you recommend we go to this region?
This is probably going to be more of a summer thing or shoulder season. Either one would probably work. I would not recommend winter just because of the chance of snowstorms, particularly for hiking.
Well, that's what I wondered once you started talking about hiking here.
Yeah, there is one part where you're kind of in, it's not a waterfall, it's just kind of water dripping off of a rock onto the trail. And so you kind of have to navigate that, and I wouldn't want to do that at any time when it's frozen, but otherwise it's not difficult.
Okay.
So Tiger Leaping Gorge is 2 or 3 hours away by bus. Some people have done the hike, which is, I want to say, 12 or 13 miles total, depending on how you do it, in a single day. I think that kind of defeats the purpose. I would recommend just leaving Lijiang in the morning, doing the hike, staying overnight, and then coming back the next day. Because I feel like, especially with considering how pretty it is, and I'm not doing justice to it. I'll give you some pictures, and your listeners can kind of look at those and hopefully see what I'm talking about. But it is really pretty, and I really think that maybe you need an overnight experience to really get the full feel for that. I know some people talk about doing it in 3 or 4 days, and I think if you go at a really relaxed pace, 3 or 4 miles a day, you can do that too. But one night overnight should suffice, I think, in Tiger Leaping Gorge.
And we're spending the night in a tea house?
Yeah. Okay. Tea houses along the way, they're fairly cheap. They provide all your food, pretty much any Western food you can think of. I mean, they have Chinese food as well, but it's actually more Western food that they tend to cook just because of the clientele.
Okay.
So I think that's about it for Lijiang, unless you have any other questions.
I do not.
Okay. I was going to take us now, actually the opposite direction, if that's okay, down to Xishuangbanna. So Lijiang was about 8 hours northwest of Kunming. Xishuangbanna is 10 or 11 hours to the south of Kunming. It's on the very edge of Yunnan, the border with Laos and Burma, and it's actually fairly close to the Vietnamese border. So it was once called a poor man's Southeast Asia. If you were in China and you couldn't get to Southeast Asia, this was as close as you could get. I don't want to make it sound like it really is Southeast Asia because it's quite different. It's still very Chinese, but there are a lot of really cool ethnic groups in the area, and there's a lot of kind of cool forests that you can go hiking in. I spent about a week down there during the Spring Festival in 2010 doing just that, hiking. I went along the edge of the Chinese-Burmese border, and I just kind of stayed with a couple of people who I ran into. The ethnic group who I spent most of my time with were the Hani ethnic group, and I was just kind of hitchhiking through the area. And I say hitchhiking, but it was a dirt road, so it's not really much of hitchhiking. I was just hiking, and someone stopped on the side of the dirt road and picked me up. And he invited me into his house. I stayed there for 3 days, actually, and just kind of explored the area, saw the village that he was living in. And I actually got invited, interestingly, into a wedding in the village, which was a lot of fun. This village has maybe 100, 200, 300 people. So anybody pretty much in the village can come to the wedding. And so I was there at the right time, and they invited me into the wedding, and that was a lot of fun. It was interesting. The craziest experience is we had to go from the groom's house to the bride's house, back to the groom's house. And when we were going from the groom's house to the bride's house, they had this tradition where they hid something. I think it was like some sort of vegetable. The bride's family hid it somewhere in the bride's house. And when the groom's party arrived at the house, they had to tear the house apart. I mean, obviously not pulling out like rafters and things like that, but tearing things out of bags, dumping bags onto the floor, pulling everything off the shelf, trying to find this. And the bride's family is just sitting there pretending like they have no idea what's going on or where this thing is. So that was a lot of fun. It went on for about 20 minutes until someone found the little baggie of stuff deep in a sack of rice, which had been dumped on the floor. And then they fed us. So that was fun. And then when they fed us, I hear this loud scream coming from outside their little hut. The Hani live in wooden huts that are built about 6 feet off the ground. And I hear this loud scream outside of their hut. And I go outside and I look. and they're carrying a live pig upside down, like you see in the movies, with both of his arms and legs tied around this one piece of wood, and he's just hanging down there. And they bring him to the edge of the house, and they cut his throat and bleed him, and that's lunch. So that was a pretty interesting experience all around, and it wasn't a wedding ceremony that I got to see, really. I mean, it was just kind of a day full of events where they went groom's house to the bride's house, back to the groom, and they had, I don't know how much I ate that day, but it was a lot. And of course, copious amounts of drinking, which was, I don't know how much. They have this kind of fire water. It's almost like a spicy kind of alcohol. I don't even know how to describe it. But they forced the groom to take, I remember one time they forced him to take 10 shots of this. And he was constantly drinking throughout the day, too, so I don't know how much he had before or after that. But it was really rough for him. I did not envy him having to drink that much. It looked horrible. So I just kind of did that, and I'd recommend your listeners do something like that. Of course, like you said, I've spent a lot of time in China. I speak Mandarin, but this is not something that you have to speak Mandarin to do. If you don't speak Mandarin, you will need a guide. And those kind of things can be arranged in Xishuangbanna's capital city, Jinghong. There's one cafe called Forest Cafe, and they arrange them. I think it's probably going to be like 100 renminbi, 200 renminbi per person per day, depending on the situation. But pretty much any travel agency can arrange these kind of things. And they'll just take you somewhere off to a village, and you can spend however many days you want hanging out in the village or hiking through some areas of the forest and kind of running into all these different ethnic groups. I mentioned the Hani, but Xishuangbanna actually has some crazy number, like I think 12 or 13 different ethnic groups, which, considering all of China has 56 ethnic groups, this one county having 12 or 13 ethnic groups, it's quite a significant amount of ethnic diversity in the area. So I'm telling one story about one ethnic group, but there's so much out there in this one place that you can see. And I'm pretty sure all of the travel agencies in Jinghong can take you to see any ethnic group that you're interested in.
Now, I think you may have answered the question that I had for you that I thought of before you came on the show is, now, you started going to China in what year? I know you were on in 2009 talking about Beijing. You'd already spent a number of months there. So how many months have you spent in China, all told, since you started going there?
24 months, probably.
Okay. So my question for you was going to be, does China still hold surprises for you? And it sounds like yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's always something around the corner.
Besides the one you were just telling about, the wedding ceremony, for instance, or the wedding feast, I think is more accurate. What other things surprised you in this particular trip to China?
There's always so much more to learn. You think you've got it down, and then one day you run into something, and you're looking at China from a completely different perspective. It's such a huge country. There are all these different perspectives, different ways to look at it. You're just constantly learning something, and you can never grasp it. I suppose if you go to a small country, it's the same way too, but you're constantly trying to negotiate things, and you're constantly learning the way that they do things. But I feel like with a smaller country, you can kind of get a hold of it a little bit easier. With China, there's just no way. And as soon as you feel like you've gotten a hold of it, you're going to get knocked off balance.
Well, that's kind of what I'm looking for. Is you've been to Beijing, for instance, for months. So you get down here to Yunnan, and you think you know the way things run. When was your first evidence that you didn't?
When I was down in Xishuangbanna, I got picked up by the police several times just because we're in a border area, and they were curious as to what I was doing there. So dealing with them, it's very different from dealing with an average Chinese citizen. They were fine. They were nice enough to me. But the different way that they treat you and this kind of, I don't know, strictness and kind of starch discipline that they had dealing with them, that was definitely a wake-up call. Like, I'm not in Kansas anymore, that kind of thing.
Okay. Anything else we want to see down in Xishuangbanna?
There's actually not that much to see there per se. I mean, There are a couple of different things. If you look in your Lonely Planet, I would just say plunge in, try and see some different ethnic groups, go visit them where they live. I think that's the best thing to do if you're in Xishuangbanna. But don't be afraid of that.
Okay, and then I think you had a third destination for us.
Yeah, the third and final destination that I wanted to talk about was Zhongdian, or it's also called Shangri-La. It's about 4 hours north of Lijiang, so we're talking 12 hours from Kunming by bus. This is on the very edge of the Tibetan world. Like Lijiang, it has a cool old town that's a Tibetan center. It's been quite touristy, but it's not like Lijiang in that just because this is so far away from anywhere, there aren't that many tourists, and it doesn't feel overrun with tourists. It feels kind of like a legitimate, real center of Tibetan culture. It's not, I mean, Lijiang now is just tourism in the city center. Shangri-La definitely still has a Tibetan feel, and there's a cool Tibetan temple on top, or I guess not on top, but above the old city that you can climb to. So it really does have a Tibetan feel to it, unlike Lijiang, which is just kind of tourism. And I should probably explain this. I said this town has two names, Zhongdian and Shangri-La. The Chinese name used to be Zhongdian, and then in, I think 2001, the county wanted to promote tourism, so they claimed that they had discovered that this was the place that book Lost Horizons was based off of, Shangri-La, and so they renamed it. So I'll use Zhongdian. Sometimes people will refer to it as Shangri-La.
Okay.
Other things to do in town, just kind of explore the old town. That's a really cool area. There's also the Congzanlin Temple. It is about 3 or 4 miles outside of the city center on kind of the edge or the periphery of the town. And it's a very big Tibetan Buddhist center. It's the largest Tibetan Buddhist center in Yunnan. And I guess I should say, I don't know if I've made this clear, probably 70 or 80% of this part of Zhongdian, of this northwestern corner of Yunnan, is ethnically Tibetan. So we're talking a very real Tibetan place. And one of the reasons I like to recommend this area is because when foreigners go to Tibet, it's actually quite expensive because you have to get a special permit. That is not required here. And you're seeing a part of Tibet that may actually be better preserved than some of the other areas. One thing I should probably throw in there is recently in the news, there's been word of self-immolation of Tibetans.
Right, in protest, right?
Right, in protest. So I'm not sure of what the situation is for foreigners traveling there. I mean, when I was there, it was calm, and so I don't know if things have changed, I guess is what I'm saying. If you get to Kunming and you want to go to Zhongdian, definitely you want to check out what the situation is there. Talk to someone in the hostel or the hotel. I just kind of want to mention that because it's so topical right now and it's actually happening. I don't know if things will get better or worse when someone's downloading this in 2 or 3 months and listening to it. So I just kind of wanted to say that. Right outside of the old town, there's an interesting museum. Talks mostly about Tibetan medicine in the area. And it's an interesting museum. I like it. One thing you have to, I don't even know if it's really a warning, but just kind of a heads up. They'll have someone oftentimes take you through and give you a tour for free in English. And then they'll take you to a room and they'll try and sell you overpriced Tibetan medicine. So it's an interesting museum, but it is for profit, even though it's run by the government. It's very much for profit, and they're looking to earn a little bit of extra money there. So just something to watch out for. As far as the town, I think that's about it. But the area around this is very Tibetan. So I would definitely recommend your listeners exploring that area. I guess I should probably tell you what happened to me. So we went from the city of Zhongdian to the small village called Luoji, which is in a fairly low area of the province. It's in a river valley. And that little village had the ethnic group E there. So we kind of started out hiking from there, and we were going to a village called Niru, which was maybe 15, 20 miles from Luoji. So we went through and we hiked along this road along the river valley, and it's very beautiful. We stopped. We stayed overnight in someone's house. We just kind of ran into them. And then we continued on the next day to the village of Niru, and we stayed there for a day. They were just at that time building a big guest house. So they're starting to see an influx of tourism. A foreigner was kind of working with them and helping them try and bring in tourists to that area. They actually technically hadn't opened, so I'm not sure what the guest house is like officially. It was very nice when we were there. The next day, things started to get pretty interesting. We hiked out of that river valley, and we were going to try and make it over to a national park, which was just over this one, I don't want to say mountain range because that makes it sound really huge, but this one set of mountains. So we did that, and as soon as we started, it starts to rain. And we're like, oh, man, this is not going to be fun. So we continue on 3, 4, 5 hours. And when we get to the top of the mountain range, we hit a giant meadow, and it starts to snow. This is in April, by the way. So we're going along there, and we're wet. It's snowing. We can't really see that much. It was pretty horrible. We wandered for a little while, and we didn't lose the trail. The trail just kind of dead-ended. One of my friends wanted to go one way. I wanted to go another way. We went my way. It was the wrong way, as so often happens in my life. We actually went across the meadow for about an hour, and then we went down into a separate meadow, and it stopped snowing, or I guess it didn't stop snowing, but we went down low enough so that it was raining instead of snowing. So I was like, oh, thank goodness, things are starting to turn up. We go down through another meadow and down into this gorge, and the trail just disappears. We keep going for whatever reason. I know the reason. It was my hard-headedness. I wanted to keep going. I would say it's one of those situations where you, as a guy, refuse to ask directions, except for there was no one there. There were no trails, no houses. We had seen one house for, I guess, 2 or 3 houses in the meadow up above. So it got to about 6 o'clock, and we just fortunately found a little rock overhang. The rock overhang had some blankets underneath where apparently people had camped before. I mean, when I say no trail, I mean really no trail. No one goes back here. So we were really fortunate to find these blankets and this kind of little shelter area. And we camped out there for a night. No tent. We didn't really have that much food. It was a pretty miserable night. I'm not going to lie to you. It was horrible. And then we went back up the next day into the meadow, and we ran into a Tibetan yak herder. I refer to him as our Tibetan cowboy rescuer. And, my friends see him, and they're yelling at me, Lee, we got to talk to this guy. He can hopefully get us out. And he did. He took us back to where the meadow where we had taken the wrong way, and he took us to where the national park was. And we were really happy to be knowing where we were going at that point. It was pretty rough, but it was a fantastic way for it to end. So that said, I don't know that I would recommend your listeners follow that exact pathway of getting lost in a blizzard in April in Tibet. But there are things that you can do. You can talk to some of the travel agents in Zhongdian, and they can take you to some of the surrounding areas. The place where we went was called Niru. Like I said, they're opening up a guest house there. There's cool things to explore in that area. We went east of Zhongdian. If you go west of Zhongdian, you're going towards Tibet, so it gets more Tibetan. And there's actually a place called, I believe it's called Deqing. It's got a giant holy mountain that is pretty important amongst Tibetan mountains. They do the circuitous route around it 7 times or something like that. So very holy thing, and you can go there. We didn't actually go there because there was construction on the road. Foreigners couldn't get there, and you had to go this roundabout way to get there. It took you back into the main province of Tibet and came back, so we didn't have permits, so we really couldn't get there. But I would recommend, there's tons of cool hiking in that area, and this is going to be something that you definitely want to guide. Actually, even though I speak Chinese now, my friends would definitely say we probably needed a guide anyways. That would have helped us not get lost. There was actually, it was crazy because we got to that meadow, and there was a sign that said Shaduhu National Park this way, but it didn't point which way. And it's a meadow, so there are tons of different trails there. I think they call them in Chinese cha lu, so it's little small trails that are just kind of inserted in and going each and every different way. And so it was really confusing, but I don't know if I'd recommend it to everybody. But when you were asking me that question about what kind of can surprise you, that was one of those things that did surprise me. I did not expect to get lost. I did not expect for there to be a blizzard. It was just kind of one of those things that just happens and blows your mind away, and you're lucky to get out all in one piece.
Besides getting a guide, if you're going to go trekking in this area, for the whole of Yunnan, any warnings you would give?
I would definitely say it's fairly safe. talk to people in the guest houses and in the travel agencies in the area, because obviously, for example, with Sichuan-Bana, you're on the border there with Burma, which, although it's getting better right now, security situations can change.
Sure.
Same goes for the area around Tibet. Make sure you kind of understand what's going on there in the news and things like that. That would be my main warning, is definitely read up a little bit on where you're going. Talk to some people who know what the situation is there right now.
And I did read two sobering things, and I think this came from Wikipedia in terms of health. Yunnan Province is responsible for 50% of the reported malaria cases in China, so make sure you're dealing with that appropriately. And then the other one that caught me by surprise, it is presently considered the main source of plague in China. There's a sentence you don't expect to read.
There's so many diseases going around in China. I didn't actually know either of those things, and I lived there for 10 months. I don't know how dangerous it is, but definitely check out what the health situation is. I will next time now.
Well, I think that just means make sure your inoculations are up to date in terms of the other, or you're doing a prophylactic if you need to for malaria. I imagine that's going to depend on where you go, because you talked about, for instance, going up in this Tibetan area where I don't suspect it's going to be a problem. But then I also saw pictures of large rice paddies for miles and miles. Well, there, of course, we're going to have a lot more stagnant water, and I suspect that malaria is going to be just a little more prevalent there. I'd be more careful if I was in that region.
And I'm guessing that if you want to know more about malaria, I'm guessing it's going to be in that Sichuan-Bana area that I was talking about, because it's
Makes sense.
close to Laos, Burma, and Vietnam. So, I didn't know that.
Although the other thing I didn't know is apparently this is the source of tea. The Yunnan province is where tea originally comes from.
And that's a good point. Lijiang actually is a tea trading town. So it kind of sprung up, and it was called, I think, the tea horse trade or something like that. They would trade horses for tea. And that's what Lijiang was for 800 or 900 years, because Lijiang is right on the edge of Tibetan civilization and Han Chinese civilization. So you've got all the ethnic groups in between those two civilizations that are trading different things. And so tea is very important. Actually, in Sichuan-Bana, the Hani ethnic group that I stayed with, their lives have been completely revolutionized. They used to be extremely poor, slash and burn cultivators in these high mountainous areas. They'd been pushed out of the lower river valleys by larger ethnic groups. But now, I don't want to say they're rich, but when I was there, they didn't have paved roads, but they had a DVD player. So
you have to have your priorities, but
their lives have been changed by the tea trade. They're growing large amounts of tea.
Interesting. This is going to be one of our longer episodes, so I'm probably not going to ask necessarily all of my usual questions, but
Sure.
I do want to ask a couple of the standard ones. When did you feel closest to home, and when did you feel furthest from home?
Furthest from home, that's easy. It was when that pig was screaming for its life, literally. I guess I had never seen something like that. I wasn't expecting something like that. In the banquet, I ate some sort of bug for my first time in my life. It was okay.
And when you say you ate a bug, you were intentionally served a bug.
I was served a bug, and they told me it was a bug, and I consented to eat it.
Okay.
They weren't pulling anything over me. So that was where I felt farthest from home. I guess having lived in Kunming for 10 months, there wasn't one moment where I was like, wow, this is really close to home. It just started to feel like home, if that makes sense.
Sure. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Yunnan.
So one of the cool things I think about Yunnan is, it's so diverse. And so one day, I guess I was thinking about it, and I just got back to Kunming from Zhongdian, and it's a 12-hour bus ride, and I realized I was now only 12 hours away from Vietnam, and I just laughed thinking, where else in the world can you go do 24 hours on a bus and go from Tibet to Vietnam or Tibet to Laos? I think that says a lot about the province and kind of the cool things it has to offer.
Excellent. The picture that most captures this part of China for you?
I'm going to go back to Lijiang and looking at some of the pictures we took when we were hiking in Tiger Leaping Gorge with these kind of giant, almost, I don't want to say foothills of the Himalayas, but they're very close to the Himalayas. I'm not sure if they're actually part of Himalayan mountains, but just these giant mountains in the background surging up from the Yangtze River. And here we are just kind of chilling relaxing, having a beer, hiking alongside this beautiful riverway. And that really brings me back to Yunnan every time.
Excellent. Before we get to our last two questions, anything else people should know before they go down to Yunnan in southern China?
There's one thing I wanted to mention. Sometimes you ask, what do the guidebooks miss, or
Sure.
what do the guidebooks recommend that you don't want to see? And I skipped over a town called Dali, partially for time, but also I don't like Dali as much as I like Lijiang, and I know people are going to kill me for saying this, but I would actually recommend skipping Dali just because Lijiang has everything it has to offer. But I don't know, I just don't like the feel of that. So I would recommend skipping Dali if you don't have that much time.
Last two questions, and you know what they are. Finish this sentence for me. You really know you're in Yunnan, province of China, when what?
I'm going to go back to one of the things I mentioned earlier, when you can go from Tibet to Laos in 24 hours on a bus. You're in Yunnan at that point.
Okay. And if you had to summarize Yunnan in 3 words, what 3 words?
I was thinking about these, and I'm going to go with wild because of the scenery, ethnic because of all the different ethnic groups in there that are really cool to experience. And this is a little weird one, but I thought I'd throw it in there, liminal. So like being on the border, like you're on the border with Tibet and kind of the rest of China, or you're on the border with Burma and China, on the border between kind of traditional Chinese culture and these ethnic groups that are in China. So I thought I'd go with that, with liminal.
Well, I think that gets the award for the best use of an SAT word on the Amateur Traveler. So
I thought about that for a little while.
And Lee, since you've been on, you have taken some of your knowledge that you've gained here, and you've written an ebook, I understand.
Yeah, I wrote an ebook. I just published it a month ago, I believe, called Chinese Journeys, and it talks some about my getting lost in Tibet and the wedding I went to in Xishuangbanna and some other things, just general experiences in China, some essays that I'd written in the past. I just kind of wanted to publish them, and so definitely check that out. If your listeners are interested in hearing more about what I did, it's Chinese Journeys. My name's Lee Moore, and it's on Amazon in Kindle form and on Barnes & Noble as a Nook book.
Excellent. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes also. Lee, thanks so much for coming back on the show. I thoroughly enjoy all 3 of your visits, and don't be too surprised if we have you back on again.
All right. Thanks for having me again. I hope I didn't bore anyone too much. Taking so long. Huh?
Not me. Thanks for coming.
Sure. Bye.
In news of the community this week, I heard from Jamie, who replied on the Amateur Traveler Facebook community, facebook.com/Amateur Traveler, about the most recent episode about travel to India. Just finished this episode yesterday and was thrilled, saying, "Oh, I was there, etc. Thanks, David, for bringing back great memories of the Pink City. Yep, I was at the observatory, the rest of Rajasthan, and the Taj." And then I heard from Nir Ben Dov, who lives in Israel, about the recent episode about travel to southern Israel and the Negev. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to the last podcast about the Negev and the visitor's enthusiasm and passion about the place. She is so right. 2 comments. The Dead Sea is the lowest point on Earth at 423 meters below sea level, or 1,388 feet, not 100 meters. Probably even much lower because we are losing about a meter a year these days. And the Maktesh that she mentions is not really a canyon according to the geological definition. A canyon generally has a river that carves its shape with an entry and exit point. A Maktesh is a unique geological formation only found in Israel. It's closed on all sides, no river flows through it, and it only has one exit point. And thanks to Nir for making those corrections. I also heard from Rick about the episode about travel to India. I just listened to your latest podcast about India. I would like to show it to my sister and other members of my family, and my iPad is not the best way of showing it. If I connect my iPad to the TV using an HDMI cable, can I show at least the interview portion of the podcast, or does it have to be some sort of video format? And my answer to that is I'd have to say I don't know. I have an iPad. I have never connected it to a TV. I don't have a way of connecting it to an HDMI cable. So if someone knows an answer to that question, if you could get back to me on that, I would appreciate it for Rick's sake. With that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, feel free to send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, leave a comment on the episode at amateurtraveler.com, or go to the Facebook community, facebook.com/amateurtraveler. You can also follow me on Twitter @Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.